You know what's disappointing? Bert Kreischer's The Machine. Not to say that it was a bad movie per se, more kind of just like it wasn't what it was advertised to be. Bert kept on kind of going on his podcast and other interviews and all kinds of press tour and everything for this movie saying that it was going to bring back comedies, like the old comedies from like the 80s and 90s where it was like slapstick and in your face and kind of like not knowing where things were going, and it was kind of like a little bit racy sometimes or a little bit feministic sometimes, but it was all played for laughs, kind of based off of like other comedians and stuff. But what we ended up getting was more of just a regular kind of action style movie. It wasn't as big of like an action movie as like Mission Impossible or a Fast and Furious style movie where there's a bunch of explosions and guns and car chases and stuff like that, because there still was some of that type of criteria. But my point being kind of, it wasn't advertised to be like that. It was still a pretty good movie. I did actually still like it. So let's kind of get into it and break down a little bit some of the pros and cons of this movie. Alright, so let's talk about the pros. First thing I want to kind of talk about is I actually kind of liked the pacing of this movie. They did a really good job of kind of introducing the characters and telling who they are and why they're important. Like Bert's kids, his wife, and then even his father. It was a really good way of introducing to say who they are and then kind of get into the story of what is happening in the movie. Then they kind of just moved on and got to the point to tell the story that they were trying to tell. The next thing I want to talk about is like the fact that even though I did say there wasn't that much comedy, there was some kind of good funny moments that did actually have me laughing a little bit, especially when it comes to the scenes with Bert's dad, who's played by Mark Hamill. There's a part where he gets captured by the Russian mob and they kind of bring him to their hideout. By the time Bert comes back to like rescue him, he's not being tortured at all. He's just having a good fun moment and they're just partying and he's having zinger after zinger. I found that part to actually be kind of comedic and kind of funny, which ended up working really well for the film. But speaking about Mark Hamill, I did really like him and Bert's chemistry together, especially considering Mark Hamill's so much up here as an actor and Bert is he's a stand-up comedian, so he's not exactly the biggest actor. So I found it really good on how Mark was able to bring his kind of level down a little bit to kind of match Bert's style. It really helped the kind of father-son dynamic that they have kind of play off really well and make it kind of seem realistic. Kind of the dad trying to constantly putting down the son kind of trying to get dad's approval. It's definitely a kind of real life type of situation. Next, I have one that's kind of a pro and a little bit of a con though, was like the fight scenes. I actually really liked the fight scenes in this movie. They were really kind of like quick and strategic. You can definitely tell that the fight coordinator knew what they were doing. Though one thing that I have in the kind of negative part of these fights is that it seemed a little bit too kind of John Wick style of a lot of dodging, maneuvering, grips, fights, stabs, that type of stuff. Whereas that seems a little off-putting for who these characters are. And I find it kind of hard to believe that just because you're a mobster means that you have all this crazy good fighting skills. It seemed too clean and tactile and precise to be a mobster's fighting style. But they were cool and entertaining to watch for sure. The other kind of positive thing I wanted to talk about was I really liked the kind of retelling of the Machine story, because showing it in this visual style was actually really good. It makes it a lot better to kind of experience what the story that Bert has told on stage multiple times was more actually like, because you not only get like the party aspect, the Russian mob aspect, the robbery aspect, like you actually see what was happening. And of course, on stage, Bert is telling the story in as much comedic way as possible. But being told in this way means you actually get to see the little more human emotion that Bert would have kind of gone through when he actually experienced this. And the actor who plays young Bert, Jimmy Trato, does a really good job of portraying the big like party aspect, taking his shirt off, having fun with them, to the emotional like, oh shit, like I shouldn't be doing this type of moment. So I think it flows really well. And then one last little pro that I have was the slight cameo of Leanne Kreischer, Bert's wife. I found it kind of funny because she plays like one of his neighbors. Instead of him kind of like ragging on her a little bit like he does on stage, kind of bugs her a little bit. Her cameo evolves around her kind of making a joke and kind of making fun of him. So I think it was definitely kind of funny letting her have that moment to kind of shine. Okay, so now let's kind of get into some of the cons. For the cons, I don't really have any kind of specific moments per se. It's kind of just more of like the overall plot kind of in general. Starting off with kind of talking about like why the watch was so important. I understand that this was a watch that belonged to like the leader of the Russian mob, so it was kind of important to him, but there's not a real reason as to why. I would have liked to see it being something like maybe his wife or his mother or child or someone maybe gave to him when they were maybe still alive. Now it's a sentimental reason, but it's kind of just thrown there as like, okay, get this watch for me to now run the family of the mob family, but there's not really anything that majorly ties this specific thing to him. So kind of continuing off of that, it's not majorly explained as to why they're coming after Bert like 25 years later. If this watch was so kind of big and important, then why were they waiting so long to kind of go after him to get this watch back? It doesn't seem to have enough of a value to want to wait all this time to want to get it back all of a sudden. And then through all this, the biggest thing that I also really didn't like about this whole situation was where they ended up finding it.
Holy shit, that's the watch! Oh, my father has a watch!
So it turns out that basically throughout the entire time, Igor, who was the kind of like bodyguard of Bert's class when he was younger, ended up keeping not only the watch, but all of the jewelry and everything that they stole from Bert's class. And that seems kind of bizarre to me, especially in this Russian mob kind of situation. Because why would someone hold on to something that they stole over like 25 years ago, they got given to, and it just, like, why would you do that? The whole point of stealing things is to sell it to get the money for it, or trade or whatever. It just seems very implausible to me that you would just still have all these random miscellaneous items just for a keepsake. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And then Igor still keeping on to this watch through all this time, that makes a little bit more sense because it ended up being the one thing that Bert gave directly to Igor as the kind of like remember this type of situation moment type of item. Yeah, people might keep on to some sentimental items like that, but using it all the time and that just happens to be the final piece of the puzzle, like happens to finally find it with the person that they're looking for as well. It just seems kind of like lazy to me. That's kind of like the last little bit I have about this watch situation. The only other kind of con I really wanted to talk about was like the random kind of funny moments that were not funny at all. The biggest example I have of this was the whole like, did I do that moment when they're kind of referencing Steve Urkel from Family Matters. I understand that Bert's main audience is definitely going to be older, so they're going to remember that show and therefore the kind of reference to it a little bit. So it will be a bit of a kind of like nostalgia thing for like that generation of people. But the people that are in like their 20s that are coming to see this movie, they're not going to really understand that reference. It's just going to go over people's heads. So it would have made more sense if you're going to do a reference to something, maybe do something, a reference that's more modern, that actually kind of makes more sense to the overall arching audience instead of just a specific niche group of people that will get your reference. Especially since the line was used after a moment when the woman kind of shot her father or grandfather, whoever it was that was the like mob boss.
Did I do that?
It just threw in a kind of random comedic moment that wasn't funny, that for a random callback to something that was irrelevant. So I think they needed to kind of handle like the comedy better in a movie that is meant to be a comedy. It didn't have enough comedy moments, and when there was a decent amount of it kind of just fell flat. So what did you guys think about the movie The Machine? Was it as good as you thought? Was it kind of mid? Let me know in a comment below. And if you liked this video, make sure to hit the like button. It definitely helps me out. And hit the notification bell as well. It definitely will let you know when the next video of mine comes out. And if you're not already subscribed, make sure to hit the subscribe button as well. It will help you kind of bring my videos to your page.